The target was a critical artery in Russia's war machine, a steel railroad bridge spanning the Oskol River and the massive freight transfer station just south of it. Together they formed the lifeline for Moscow's supply chain into the Luhansk front, delivering artillery shells, rocket pods, diesel fuel, and spare parts for tanks grinding away in eastern Ukraine. The bridge stretched nearly 700 feet from bank to bank, its trusses silhouetted faintly against the dim glow of the horizon. Beneath it, the Oskol's dark waters rolled slow and cold, masking the approach of danger. The transfer station, half a mile downstream, was a sprawling maze of freight cars, fuel tankers, and stacked shipping containers, each marked with stenciled Cyrillic warnings. Over the past week, reconnaissance drones had tracked constant movement here. Trains arriving every 2 hours, convoys of trucks loading under floodlights, soldiers moving crates under tarps. Satellite imagery showed a growing stockpile of munitions, an unmistakable sign that Russia was preparing another push toward Lyman. But tonight, the bridge and the station were not just logistical hubs. They were targets. And somewhere beyond the fog and the river, an incoming strike force was already closing the distance, silent, unseen, and minutes away from turning this quiet stretch of rail into twisted steel and burning wreckage. For Moscow, the Oskol River Bridge and the freight transfer station weren't just infrastructure. They were the beating heart of their eastern supply line. Losing them would mean severing the direct rail link to Lyman, forcing every shipment of ammunition, fuel, and replacement parts onto slower, more vulnerable truck convoys. The Kremlin knew this, and it had fortified the area accordingly. On the western bank, a Panzer S-1 air defense system crouched in the shadows, its twin 30mm autocannons and 12 missile tubes angled toward the sky. Less than a mile away, the 1L-122 radar station scanned in a constant sweep, searching for anything with a heat signature or radar return out of place. The Russians had also strung a web of anti-drone floodlights along the tracks and loading yards, their beams slicing through the night like prison searchlights. To the untrained eye, it looked impenetrable layers of technology, overlapping fields of fire, and the steady hum of machinery keeping watch. But to an experienced strike planner, it also had gaps, radar blind spots where the riverbanks dipped low, timing delays in the Panzer's targeting cycle, and the simple fact that light only works if you can see through the fog. And on this night, the fog was relentless. A damp chill settled over the valley, the temperature hovering just above 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility was barely 100 feet thick enough to hide a man walking across the yard, let alone a drone flying nap of the earth along the waterline. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of Russian optics, something was moving toward the bridge. The defenses were ready for a fight, just not for the kind of fight that was coming. Beyond the fog-draped hills, Ukraine's strike package was already in motion. 18 long-range attack drones, a mix of Beaver and Scythe models, each loaded with precision-guided warheads. They weren't coming in high, loud, or fast. Instead, they hugged the earth in a textbook nap of the Earth profile, skimming barely 20-30 feet above the Oskol's dark waters. At that altitude, the river itself acted as a radar shield, bending and scattering any signal that might betray their approach. The formation split miles before the target. 2 strike groups, each with 6 drones, banked south to line up on the sprawling freight transfer station. Their mission was to gut the facility, hit the fuel tanks, detonate the ammunition stacks, and ignite the container yards until nothing inside could be salvaged. The third group, also 6 drones strong, stayed on the river, threading between frost-covered trees and under abandoned utility lines. Their heading was locked on the steel span of the Oskol Bridge, a single strike point that could paralyze Russian rail logistics for weeks. Each drone's onboard navigation blended GPS with inertial systems and terrain-matching software. Even if Russia's jammers lit up, the drones could fly blind, following stored 3D maps of the valley to within a few feet. Their electric motors purred softly, nearly indistinguishable from the ambient hum of the night. The fog, which had been Russia's ally in concealing troop and cargo movements, now became Ukraine's shield. Floodlights cut brilliant cones into the mist, but their beams stopped dead in the murk, leaving vast blind zones. Radar operators saw nothing but the static wash of ground clutter. Minute by minute, the drones closed in, invisible to both eye and screen. When they reached the strike envelope, they would hit almost simultaneously. Bridge, station and fuel yard, leaving Russia with no time to react, no space to recover, and no way to move supplies forward. They crossed the final half-mile in absolute silence, their matte black fuselages nearly invisible against the fog-dimmed river. The lead formation 3 Beaver drones, armed with 66-pound concrete-piercing warheads, rose just high enough to clear the last line of trees. Their flight computers locked onto the center span of the Oskil Bridge, where 2 massive support columns rose from the riverbed like stone sentinels. At 3:46 a.m., the first drone slammed into the eastern pillar. The warhead punched through reinforced concrete before detonating, sending a shockwave so violent that it rattled windows in the small settlement 2 miles away. Before the echo had faded, the second drone hit the opposite column, tearing open a jagged fracture that bled chunks of stone and twisted rebar into the water below. The third drone drove straight into the center truss, its explosion producing a spray of molten steel that rained down onto the ice-flecked river surface. On the west bank, the Russian Panzer S 1 air defense battery came to life. Search radars spun, missile tubes elevated, and autocannons barked into the fog. But they weren't firing at the bridge attackers. Above them, at about 165 feet, a lone scythe drone acted as bait-blinking heat signatures, broadcasting false radar returns and weaving erratically to mimic a larger swarm. The decoy drew the Panzer's full attention. Its guns spat tracer fire into the night, chasing the Phantom, while missile locks cycled uselessly through false targets. In those critical seconds, the real strike drones at river level went unchallenged. By the time Russian operators realized their mistake, it was too late. The eastern column was already cracked through its core. The western footing was listing, and the central span sagged like a bowstring under strain. A deep groan of metal carried across the valley, a warning that the bridge's death was not just imminent, but inevitable. The breach was complete. Russia's untouchable supply artery had been mortally wounded in less than 60 seconds, and the real storm had yet to arrive. They broke from the river at less than 200 yards out, 3 Beaver drones in the lead, each carrying a 66-pound concrete-penetrating warhead designed to punch through reinforced steel and stone. Their flight path was locked on the Oskil Bridge's central support pier, the single structural point that, if destroyed, would drop the span into the river below. The drones came in low and fast, barely 15 feet above the water, their composite frames almost invisible to radar. In the fog, they looked like nothing more than drifting shadows until they climbed in unison for the final approach. At 300 feet from the target, each drone's electric motor whined into a sharper pitch as they accelerated to over 120 miles per hour. The first impact came like a cannon shot, the warhead boring deep into the pier before detonating. A shockwave rolled through the valley, rattling windows in the houses a half-mile away. The second drone struck 3 seconds later, hitting the opposite side of the pier and shattering the main rebar lattice. The third followed almost instantly, delivering the final blowstone and steel bursting outward in a cloud of debris, the deep thud of collapsing concrete echoing over the water. On the western bank, a Panzer S 1 air defense unit snapped awake. Its targeting radar swung toward the river, and in seconds the twin 30mm cannons were spitting fire into the fog. Tracers lit up the night, stitching glowing arcs into the mist, but the gunners were chasing ghosts. 50 meters above the bridge, 2 decoy drones were weaving erratically, broadcasting false radar signatures and drawing every shot the Panzer could throw. While the cannons tracked upward, the real strike drones were already clear of the engagement zone, their mission complete. The bridge still stood for now, but the heart of its structure was gone. Every passing second brought it closer to collapse, and the Russian defenders had no idea the worst was yet to come. The blast at the bridge was only the opening note. Less than 5 seconds later, the rest of the strike package swept in from the South 12 drones fanning out over the sprawling freight transfer station. From above, the facility looked like an industrial labyrinth. Rows of fuel tankers, stacked shipping containers, flatbed rail cars loaded with crates, all lit by floodlights bleeding into the fog. The first wave hit the fuel yard. 6 scythe drones dove almost vertically, each carrying a 44-pound high-explosive charge engineered to ignite volatile liquids. The impacts were staggering, warheads punching through tanker hulls, splitting steel like paper. One mission touched off a chain reaction. Fuel geysered into the air, igniting mid-flight and cascading back down in sheets of fire. The yard became an inferno, orange flames curling hundreds of feet into the night sky. The second wave banked hard toward the container stacks. 3 drones targeted rows marked with hazardous material symbols, their warheads shattering the thin walls and spraying burning fuel across neighboring cars. Within seconds, the fire leapt to a train loaded with artillery shells idling on the adjacent track. What happened next was chaos in its purest form. The first shell cooked off with a sharp crack, followed by another, then another, until the night was filled with a deafening staccato, like a string of giant firecrackers tearing the air apart. Entire boxcars blew open, steel fragments spinning across the yard. A blast wave knocked over floodlight towers, plunging half the facility into shadow. Russian troops scattered, some diving for cover behind concrete barriers, others frozen in place, staring at the sky in disbelief. The anti-air gunners tried to bring the Panzer's cannons to bear, but the flames, smoke, and confusion turned their targeting screens into a blur of static. In less than 2 minutes, the fuel yard was gone, the container stacks were burning, and the ammunition train was nothing but twisted metal. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning diesel. And somewhere in that darkness, the drones still hadn't finished their work. The roar of secondary explosions still echoed through the valley when the bridge finally gave way. Already weakened by the initial strike, its central pier could no longer bear the load. With a groan of tearing steel and snapping rivets, the bridge didn't fall all at once. For nearly 30 seconds, it groaned under its own weight, concrete dust spilling into the river like smoke. Then, with a final cracking roar, a 215-foot span collapsed into the Oskil, sending a geyser of water and debris into the air. The rail line was severed, completely inoperable for the foreseeable future. At the freight yard, the destruction was staggering. Satellite heat signatures later confirmed that 70% of the facility was either burning or reduced to rubble. 14 rail cars, many loaded with ammunition, were gone, reduced to twisted steel frames. More than 40 shipping containers were engulfed in flames, their contents boiling, bursting, or simply incinerated. The fuel yard was an unrecognizable crater, still glowing orange from residual fire. Black smoke billowed thousands of feet upward, drifting east toward the border. Communications from Russian logistics units abruptly went silent. The entire sector's supply network had just been amputated. And in the smoldering dark, the only sound was the hiss of burning metal and the slow, echoing collapse of what had once been the heart of Russia's rail lifeline to the east. By dawn, Russian commanders were already facing an operational nightmare. With the Oskil Bridge lying in the river and the Kupiansk transfer yard reduced to ash, the Army's primary supply artery to the Lyman-Seversk sector was gone. Analysts estimated it would take at least 3 weeks to restore even partial rail service. Until then, every round of artillery ammunition, every gallon of diesel, and every replacement part for tanks or APCs would have to move by truck on a route more than 95 miles longer than before. That detour wound through exposed highways and narrow rural roads, all within range of Ukrainian drones, Hawaii Mars strikes, and partisan ambushes. For Russian logistics officers, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a widening kill zone. Every extra mile meant more fuel consumed, more drivers exposed, more convoys to guard. The precision strike hadn't just damaged infrastructure, it had surgically removed a critical node in Russia's entire Eastern Front strategy. And somewhere in Kyiv, planners were already mapping the next weak link to cut. In the end, it wasn't billion-dollar bombers or massive armored offensives that severed Russia's eastern lifeline. It was a swarm of drones worth only tens of thousands of dollars. Precision, planning, and timing had turned low-cost machines into a force multiplier, toppling a strategic hub valued in the hundreds of millions. The lesson was as stark as the black smoke still curling over the Oskil. In modern war, supply lines are not defended by distance or fortifications, but by staying